Good evening. My name is Molly Anderson, and on behalf of the Nantucket Atheneum, I would like to welcome you to our final lecture series of the summer. First, could I ask you to turn off your cell phones if you haven't done so already? None of these lectures would be able to take place if it wasn't for the wonderful, wonderful generosity of Nan and Chuck Geschke, who started this series in 2005, and it's been going strong ever since. Please take a moment to thank the Geschkes. And now Chuck Geschke is going to join us to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Nice thing about having Molly introduce us is she always asks for applause. Nice. Well, good evening and welcome to this evening's Geschke lecture. I'm absolutely honored and delighted to introduce this evening's speaker, the Honorable Kevin Rudd, who held the office as leader of the Australian Labor Party and served as the 26th Prime Minister of Australia from December 2007 to June of 2010, and again from June to September in 2013. Kevin was born in Nambour, Queensland. He has a degree in Chinese studies from the Australian National University, and he is fluent in Mandarin. However, he has assured me that this evening's lecture will be given in Australian English, for which we are all grateful. Rudd announced his retirement from politics a few months after the 2013 election, and in February of 2014, he was named a senior fellow at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, where he completed a major research effort on the future of China-United States relations. In September of 2014, he became a distinguished fellow at the University of Chicago's Paulson Institute. He's also the inaugural president of the Asia Society Policy Institute, where he chairs the Independent Commission on Multilateralism, as well as the Sanitation and Water for All Global Partnership. I'm sorry, I botched that up. Don't practice your speech on what I'm saying, Kevin. Make sure. So now, let's give Kevin Rudd a warm round of Nantucket applause.
Thanks, Chuck. I'm just turning my stopwatch on because there's no clock in this room. So I hope it works. Go. Stop. Here we go. Start. Oh, it's going now. Thank you very much, Chuck, and to you and to Nan for sponsoring this lecture series. And Molly from the, do we call it here the Atheneum or the Atheneum? The Atheneum. And the work that you do in terms of promoting the public intellectual culture of this community. And to you, the good burgers of Nantucket, seasonal or permanent, as is your fashion. And I also have noticed in the audience, where's Joe Clark, former Prime Minister of Canada, who's with us this evening. Thank you, Joe, for the Commonwealth solidarity of being here this evening. Then if Canada and Australia can be for you, who can be against you? Well, I'll give you a long list, actually, but I don't think that was so good. I'll work on that. I think we'll just turn that right off. It's going better. And if I could also honour the Wampanoag people of the Algonquin Nations as the first peoples of this island. and on whose lands we meet and whose cultures we continue to celebrate. Well, thank you so much for this invitation. This is a good occasion to be here. I've had the opportunity to come to this beautiful island now for the last 4 summers. Not for long periods of time, but short periods of time, and quietly but inexorably have fallen in love with the place. It's a remarkable part of America, and I know you as its committed residents have that same deep view. It's not just the beauty of its natural environment. I was out swimming, would you believe, at Great Point a couple of days ago. Just me and the dolphins, and hoping that the great whites weren't there. But I was carrying a diplomatic passport just to show them that they should go and munch somebody else rather than me. But it's also the extraordinary history of this community as well, and the history of whaling. No one can come to Nantucket and not read the history of the Essex, the extraordinary story of that whaling nautical saga, which speaks to all the questions of universal humanity. And for the record, I note that one of the sets of survivors from the Essex was actually rescued by an Australian whaler way back when. So an early evidence of alliance solidarity back in 1821 when we weren't allies. But it was the right thing to do. When I think of the first European settlement here, which I think was in the 1640s, is that right? You're 150 years before there was European settlement in Australia. So you got something of a head start on us. And it's a remarkable continuing architectural legacy you have here as well. In fact, there's a great coincidental point of reference between this country's history and the history of my own, and that is, and Joe's to some extent, Joe Clark's, and that goes back to the history of the Revolutionary War. Had you lost the Revolutionary War against the British, A, the Canadians would have been much happier, but B, the British would not have lost their penal colony in Savannah in Georgia. And it was only because they lost their penal colony in Savannah in Georgia that the Admiralty literally took out their dusty charts and said, where can we put British crims? The answer, of course, was Australia. And at that stage, there was no European settlement at all. And so literally the first fleet arrived in Australia in 1788. My forebears, criminals on both sides of my family, just for the record. And so it's important to establish the bloodlines for a future career in politics early. My forebears were on the second fleet, which arrived in 1790. It was known in Australian colonial history as the Death Fleet. The first fleet had been such an extraordinary success, no lives lost on a 9-month voyage from Southampton to Sydney, New South Wales, and there was nothing in Sydney, just a bit of dirt. But because there were no lives lost, what did the British government and the Admiralty do at the time? They established a royal commission, this extraordinary waste of public funds. And so on the second fleet, you'll be interested to know, and a wonderful example of 18th century public policy, they put it out to tender. Who won the tender? A West African slaver. And my forebears were on said boat, 40% of whom died on the way. And the reason was, one of the conditions of the tender, students of public policy pay attention to this, was that the owner of the convict fleet would be able to keep as their own property any surviving victuals at the end of the voyage. That's what we call in contemporary public policy a perverse price signal. Anyway, my forebear actually managed to survive that and arrived, scrambled ashore in 1790 in Sydney, was emancipated in 1795, and then decided to return to England via China, an early connection for me. So you might ask, well, what happened? He's the only convict in Australian political history, or Australian convict history to have then reoffended. And so back he goes to London. 1799, he gets done again. This time not just for stealing a pair of shoes, which is really inoffensive, but a major capital crime, which is stealing a bag of sugar. And so he gets sent out for another 7 years. By that stage, he'd learned his lesson, we think. But the last piece of correspondence we have him as an emancipated convict, living just to the west of Sydney, writing a letter in the Sydney Daily Gazette on behalf of his local community to the Governor of New South Wales, demanding an improvement in local public works, signed Thomas Rudd, Esquire. So there's hope for us all. Now, had you guys lost the Revolutionary War, I could well have ended up as the Governor of Georgia instead. And probably with a form of the Queen's English as uninterpretable and ununderstandable as mine today. So, history has some strange twists and turns. This evening, I've been asked to speak about the US and China. And specifically, the subject of the talk is the future of US-China relations and what I call the avoidable war. And why have I chosen that? It's not just because of its topicality, it's not just because we read every day about the ebbs and flows of the trade war between the United States and China. It's also because there is a body of literature, both in Beijing and in the United States now, which begins to point in the direction of an inescapable economic decoupling between the two countries, a certain inescapable foreign policy confrontation between the two countries, and even, in the argument of some, ultimately an inescapable military conflict as well. Graham Allison, a colleague of mine from Harvard University, some of you may have read his book entitled Destined for War, is an historical examination of what he describes as Thucydides' trap, based on his reflections of the Peloponnesian Wars. Namely, back in 5th century Greece, that it was the rise of Athens and the cause of fear and anxiety. It was the rise of Sparta and the fear and anxiety that created in 5th century Athens, which caused Athens to act, to preempt Sparta's further rise. Anyway, if you look carefully at Graham's book, and it's worthy of a good read, and he's a close Harvard colleague of mine, he then adduces 16 historical case studies of rising powers and established powers from the 15th century to the present, and concludes that in 12 of those 16 case studies, they have indeed ended in war. 4 have been the exception. 12 have accorded to that particular rule. So that's kind of the background against which we now see an emerging literature that these two countries, the United States and China, are in the long term destined for economic, technological, and possibly physical warfare in one form or another. I do not accept that proposition, and that's why I'm talking to you this evening. I know it's hard, I know it's difficult, and I know the fault lines between the two countries are significant, but I've never in my life had a determinist view of history that somehow these things have been determined by the gods and are anchored in the stars and our destiny is somehow unchangeable. We have a term for that in Australia. It starts with B and it ends with T. And there's a few other letters in between. But basically, the polite form of it is nonsense. We shape our own destinies. And that as much applies to how the United States and how China and how US allies work together to try and carve out a sustainable future between these two countries, which will be sharp, competitive, difficult, and the rest, while avoiding a slow and inexorable slide into one form of conflict or another. So that's what I'll talk to you about tonight. In the next 20 minutes, I want to just touch on 3 topics within that. The first, I think, is important, which is to understand what is China's grand strategy. How does China view the world? Often we simply project. We hear a bit here, we hear a bit there, and we think they may be just like anybody else. It's a little different. China has a unique historiography and has a unique civilizational continuity. But I think what I'd like to do to begin with is just to spend 5 minutes or so going through this grand strategy and hierarchy of policy priorities which the Chinese leadership has. Secondly, what I'll then touch on is, well, how are they going in the implementation of this strategy? What's working and what's not? And the third and concluding point will be, in terms of America's strategic response against the parameters of an avoidable war, what would be the core characteristics of an effective long-term American strategy to respond to China's rise? And then I will tell some jokes. That was a joke, by the way. Firstly, on Chinese grand strategy, let's just imagine for a moment that we are members of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. We're sitting in Beijing, and frankly, there are about as many members of the Central Committee as there are people in this room this evening. The Standing Committee of the Politburo is made up of 7 humorless men. You don't get prizes at Standing Committee meetings for your bon mot and repartee. It's a fairly serious engagement. I know probably about half of them and have worked with them over the years, and I know something of how they view the world. So from where they sit, what are their order of priorities? And I will dance through these fairly quickly. There are 7 of them. And the best mental picture, I think, to have of this order of priorities is as a set of concentric circles, starting from core priorities and then moving out. Priority number 1 is keep the party in power. Keep the party in power. It's a Marxist-Leninist party. It won power through the barrel of a gun, through a revolutionary war in 1949. It's held onto that power through the events of Tiananmen in 1989 and has no intention whatsoever of changing its political stripes if it can possibly get away with it. It wishes to remain in power. That is not just a utilitarian view of, I just want to be in power because we've become the elite and I like being the elite. It's also an ideological view that they uniquely are capable of holding the country together and taking it into its long-term economic and military modernisation. Priority number 2, concentric circle number 2, maintain and sustain national unity. You might think that's self-evident. If you've got a major problem in Xinjiang with the Uyghur population in the northwest of the country, if on top of that you have what they would describe as a renegade province in Taiwan, which has not been part of the country since 1949 and is drifting further away from them in terms of Taiwan's own domestic political sentiment, and now if you followed the events of the last several weeks, Hong Kong, this is no simple equation. But in Chinese classical historiography, no one gets the prize of being, as it were, the emperor positively reviewed in Chinese history unless they hold the empire together. And this is therefore both historiography, in terms of Chinese historiography, critical, but in terms of the Communist Party's own claim to ideological legitimacy, fundamental as well. Priority number 3, grow the economy. Grow it for 2 reasons. Take people out of poverty, raise living standards, take China eventually to middle and then advanced economy status, with per capita income to demonstrate that, in order to consolidate your political legitimacy as a communist party able to deliver the economic goods to your people. And secondly, as a consequence of that, develop state capacity and power so that the power of the Chinese state is then sufficiently resourced to do what China wishes to do in the world. Priority number 4. China has 14 land neighbours and 6 states with whom it shares disputed territorial maritime boundaries. With those 20 states, China's aspiration and core strategic objective is to have as benign and compliant relationships with those 20 states as possible. If you're familiar with the days of the Soviet Union and its relationship with countries in then Northern Europe, as the Soviet Union then pursued a policy of what you could describe as Finlandization in Helsinki, that's not a dissimilar framework to how China sees its future relationship with its neighbours. It has no interest in militarily occupying those countries, None whatsoever. It does, however, have an interest in ensuring that they are benign towards all China's self-defined core interests. And the biggest subset of that is Russia, to which I'll turn in a minute. Number 5 out of 7 is on China's Eastern Maritime periphery to push the United States back from where it is. The term often used is to push the United States back to what is called the first island chain. If you picture on a map where Japan is, draw a line down to Taiwan, run that line from Taiwan down to the Philippines, and prescribe an arc around the southern perimeters of the South China Sea, that's the first island chain. And at present, China's military strategy and naval modernization strategy and rocket force strategy, as well as its air force strategy, is designed to push the United States strategic perimeter back to that line, and ultimately to what's called the second island chain, which about lines up with Guam. There's a reason for that, from their point of view. My point here this evening is to explain to you how they see reality, not to defend it. From their perspective, if they are to secure Taiwan's return by force to the mainland, if all other political and diplomatic mechanisms fail, then they must achieve it by preventing the United States from acting with freedom within that maritime zone through a strategy of what's called air-sea denial. Parallel to that, what the Chinese are seeking to do within that perimeter is to break traditional American alliances with the ROK, Republic of Korea, Japan, and also with the Philippines, Thailand, and ourselves in Australia. The standard critique is these are residues of the Cold War, and they are all anti-Chinese. Why do you need them? We don't threaten anybody. Number 6 is on China's western periphery. If you look at the map and push across the Eurasian landmass to Europe, China's desire is to turn that wider region not only into a benign strategic environment, but also a major new zone of economic opportunity for Chinese exporters, for Chinese investors, and for Chinese infrastructure builders as well, pushing that right through to Western Europe, Rotterdam, on the Atlantic coast, and to the Middle East and into East Africa. You will have heard of the Belt and Road Initiative from the Chinese. That's its core organising principle. Both a maritime Silk Route around the various points along the Indian Ocean to the Gulf of Aden and then through to the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal, and a land Silk Route as well across the Eurasian continent, underpinned by a massive rail investment which lands Chinese goods in Spain and in Rotterdam and elsewhere. And finally, number 7, in China's grand plan, China's grand strategy, is to bit by bit change the global rules-based order in a manner which is more accommodating of China's domestic interests and values. It does not seek to upend the global rules-based system as such, anchored in the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Trade Organization, the international human rights treaties, but it seeks to, over time, change their content and their culture and their personnel in a manner which is more accommodating of China's domestic interest. That's my best summary of China's grand plan. Now, point number 2, subject number 2, how are they doing? A fair question, and I'll spend a few minutes on that. If you run through that list, on the question of the party remaining in power and how it's being sustained, Xi Jinping has further consolidated personal power. The party is now stronger than it was before he took over. But new emerging structural challenges are also beginning to emerge. Number 1, because he's consolidated so much power internally in his own hands, there is a degree of disgruntlement on the part of various others who have been marginalised from the political decision-making process in Beijing. Secondly, also because of the expansion of China's growth strategy over time, the Chinese private sector, led by a class of Chinese entrepreneurs, have gone from marginal players to central players in the Chinese economy. They now represent 61% of GDP and growing. 90% of all employment growth, 80% of all innovation, 61% of GDP, and more than 50% of taxes are paid by the private sector. But here's the rub. Therefore, you're creating a locus of power within the Chinese system other than the Communist Party. And you have, therefore, an evolving, complex debate between private sector and public sector, between party and market over the best policy mix for the future. And in recent times, Chinese private entrepreneurs, the last couple of years, have begun to sit on their hands, waiting for clarity for the future, but conducting an increasingly transparent private fixed capital investment strike. Hence why you start to see China's growth rates come down. And then thirdly, in terms of the party's hold on power, there is the power of religion. Often doesn't appear much in the international literature. But I've been in and out of China now for the last 35 years, travelled to most provinces, and have some feel for what's going on with Taoism, China's traditional religion, Buddhism, originally imported from India, and certainly Christianity, which comes from the West, and principally here, the United States. You've seen this phenomenal growth, firstly in Protestant Christianity, which when the revolution occurred in 1949, there were 1 million Protestant Christians in China. Now, based on most people's estimates, it's around 70 million. Buddhists, at the time of the revolution, probably about 100 million active Buddhists, now much more in the vicinity of 300 million. And Taoists somewhere between, I don't know the original figures in 1949, but somewhere between 40 and 50 million. Now, none of these religious traditions within China necessarily overtly oppose the Chinese state or the Chinese Communist Party. But like the power of Chinese private entrepreneurs and the private sector, they actually represent a different ideational worldview. And slowly but surely you begin to sense and feel this unfolding set of influences. I didn't mention Catholic Christianity because it's actually remained relatively static. There were 12 million Catholics at the time of the revolution. There's about 12 million today. But in these other traditions, you see phenomenal growth. So it's a mixed bag in terms of the party in power. How about national unity, I referred to before? Well, let me just make one or two comments about Hong Kong, and we can take it further in the Q&A if that's what you'd like. Hong Kong represents what you've seen recently, a set of challenges for the Chinese leadership. But the bottom line is this. Much commentary in the last couple of weeks has gone to the intensification of Chinese troop and paramilitary preparations on the Shenzhen side of the Hong Kong border. In other words, leading to commentary that maybe they're thinking of doing what they did back in 1989 and unleash the military to secure political control. At this stage, my judgment is, based on all the evidence we have as of today, that is highly unlikely. The Tiananmen experience has been hugely searing on the political psychology of the Chinese leadership. They went into effectively 3 years of financial sanctions from the rest of the world. They're already dealing with President Trump's trade war. They've also got a softening economy for the domestic economic reasons I referred to before. And to add this would push things over the edge. And on top of that, I think the overall calculus beyond that particular interest is that if they were to act militarily, that is the end of any future prospect of ever having a peaceful political or diplomatic solution with Taiwan. So at this stage, even including the shutting down of Hong Kong airport overnight by the protest movement, I think that's unlikely. Nonetheless, the overall factor, I would say, is that from China's perspective is Hong Kong remains problematic, Taiwan drifting further away. In fact, the Hong Kong protest movement has made it more likely that the political party in Taiwan least accommodating of Beijing's interests, called the Democratic Progress Party, will win the next Taiwanese presidential elections due next March, creating a further complication in terms of, let's call it, the national unity agenda. The economy I've already touched on, and I'm also mindful of the time, and let's take up that further in the time for Q&A, if that's okay, Chuck. but there are a few things there to be said about domestic economic policy settings, the execution of the trade war between the US and China, and the prospects of decoupling, whether it's technological, financial, or in currency terms beyond trade. How about the border states? Priority number 4. I think this is where there has been not sufficient commentary in this country. The big shift since Xi Jinping became president of the country and General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party in 2013-14 has been the fundamental revolution that's occurred in China-Russia relations. Back in 2013-14, this relationship was thin, brittle from the past, and of limited strategic utility from Beijing's perspective and from Moscow's perspective. Roll the clock on 5 or 6 years, it's now quite different. They now speak of each other in terms of both Xi Jinping and Putin as their closest political allies in the world. They use that language. Their military exercises with each other have gone from 0 to significant and substantial. Most recently, just last year, land exercises in the Russian Far East with several thousand Chinese military participants, first time that's ever happened, and combined military exercises, naval exercises between the two in the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and would you believe, the Baltic. Something is happening quite apart from China seeking to diversify its energy sources of supply by the new gas pipeline between Russia and China, but also from Russia's perspective in the post-Ukraine invasion, sanctions environment, they see themselves financially and economically with nowhere else to go. It's not a complete bed of roses. There are still enduring frictions in that relationship. But what I've seen as someone who's spent a fair bit of time both in Beijing and Moscow over the last 5 years is a relationship go from here to about there on the spectrum. What about the maritime frontier with the United States? I think the Chinese military and naval modernization process is proceeding apace, and the ability now for Chinese land-based rocket forces to take out US carrier battle groups and stationary US forces in the West Pacific, both in Japan, in Okinawa, in Yokohama, and in Guam, and elsewhere, is now formidable to the point that it is a central preoccupation, not a marginal preoccupation, of US strategic planners. We can Q&A if you're interested, go to the question of the South China Sea. How about on the continental frontier? That is the Belt and Road Initiative I referred to before. Somewhere between a $1 and $3 trillion plan. And if you apply it against the benchmark of the Marshall Plan in Europe in the post-45 period, it's about 10 times the size in current dollar terms, if it's executed. They're several years into execution. There are as many failures as there are successes, if I'm trying to give you an honest rendition of how it's, quote, going. And one of the critiques within China itself is, why are we wasting all this money on foreign aid? Have you heard that critique in any other country in the world? What about building our skills here in China? Why are we building skills in Wagadibi land? But when you look at it on the receiving end, most of the developing countries, of whom there are about 72 who've now signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, ask one simple question when I speak to them, or they ask me for my thoughts, is, well, I don't see any alternative from the United States. I don't see anything of this order of magnitude from the global development banks or from the global private capital markets. Where else have we got to go? And finally, on the global rules-based order, what changes have happened? I think the only point I'd make there is on the success side, is that bit by bit, because of China's infinitely forensic and effective diplomacy and growing foreign aid presence, quite in addition to what they do through the Belt and Road Initiative, across Africa and across Latin America and the rest of Asia, China has accumulated a bucket load of votes for any future decisions within the United Nations or within any other multilateral institution against the future change of the rules of the system. A very quiet and patient diplomacy. Let me conclude with a few reflections on the third question, which is, should therefore be America's strategic response to the above? The caveat to this is, I'm not an American. I'm just a Prime Minister of former Prime Minister of one of your closest allies. So my reflections here are always against the caveat that I don't have to negotiate your domestic political realities. That's something which is your unique privilege in this room. And Joe Clark, I'm sure, would say the same from the perspective from those just to the north of you. Number one, I would say to our friends in Washington on the future of American grand strategy or high policy towards the People's Republic of China and China's rise, the best thing the United States can do is to have a strategy. I'm not being facetious. At present, what I detect in this country, having lived among you now for the last 4 years, is what I can describe as an American attitude towards China rather than a strategy towards China. And what is required is something infinitely more sophisticated and substantive and operational than that. If you're going to respond effectively to the challenges that we face, not just to yourselves bilaterally, but frankly in terms of the future of global geopolitics and the future of the global rules-based order. I'm not talking about another form of containment. That doesn't work. Why? Containment worked with the Soviet Union because in 1947-48, when George Kennan devised containment as the global doctrine of the United States to deploy against the emerging Soviet Empire, there was no economic engagement between the Soviet Union and the United States, nor then, nor subsequently. B, in the course of the 50s and 60s, you were fighting 20 to 30 proxy wars around the world against the Soviets in third states, in some place or another. And three, the Chinese don't have as direct an ideological, as it were, war being waged against liberal capitalism. They've got a partial and significant critique against the democracy bit of democratic capitalism, but it's not a full-blown, fundamental attempt to destroy an entire ideological system. So containment as such, I think, is inapplicable to the current circumstances. It has to be something more granular, more specific, which is designed to craft effective red lines about unacceptable Chinese behaviours against the benchmark of the global rules-based order that we have built together since 1945, while still defining areas of strategic cooperation with the Chinese as well, in critical areas such as climate change. Number two is for any future US national China strategy to understand the fundamental importance again of the balance of power. Sounds like an old axiom, but my Chinese friends, and I have dealt with them a lot over the years, ultimately respect one thing, and that is power and the ability to deploy it and to use it. It guides China's sense of where it has room to move. So on the key determinants of American power for the 21st century, technological, economic and military, if you slide in these areas, then the balance of power will change and China will have, in its own view, much greater freedom for manoeuvre to prosecute the interests I referred to before. Thirdly, therefore, the bulk of the response in terms of the 21st century, whether or not it's going to be a second American century or not, is this. What do you invest in you yourselves? How do you develop the future of your technology? How do you develop the future of your education system? How do you develop the future of STEM? How do you develop the future of tech and AI? What do you do with the future of your military? What do you do with the traditional institutions of American statecraft, the State Department, as well as United States aid? If these slide, frankly, these are measured with infinitesimal accuracy by your Chinese friends and my Chinese friends, and they'll make an aggregate calculus about whether you're serious or not. The fourth of 7 points is this. The way for the United States to actually sustain a future balance of power against most of these indicators is, in my mind, relatively clear. You cannot do it any longer unilaterally. China is too big, just too big. But you can do it in partnership with your closest allies, in Japan and in Europe, and potentially with countries like India if they're prepared to come alongside, and we Australians as well. The Canadians will provide the drinks and the entertainment. Now, the Canucks will provide the entertainment, we'll just do the booze. But the bottom line is here, if you line up any measure on gross domestic product, trade footprint, investment footprint, capital markets, together with what's happening in tech, not just in this country, not just in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, and against what's happening in Shenzhen and China, but you throw in what's happening in Germany, what's happening in Japan, and what's happening in Canada and other countries, then the equation looks quite significantly different. If you go to one of Graham Allison's most recent publications, he has this giant seesaw to try and give illustration to what a balance of power looks like. And after the Second World War, the seesaw looked like this. You guys down here and the rest of the world up there. And China, bip, a little bop there. The world today is a bit like this, with, if you took the rest of us out, the United States here and China there. By mid-century, depending on whose trajectory you look at, it's more likely to be like this. What changes in that equation is for you, the United States, to begin to have a radically different view of your allies. At present, your view of your allies is basically A, they can be a complete pain in the ass, B, occasionally they're helpful, C, sometimes they do some heavy lifting, but not often, and D, some of them are genuinely close. My burden of my argument to you is that your principal allies, most particularly Japan, given this theatre, and in Europe, Germany, are absolutely essential to the future prosecution of the American and Western national interest. Two last points. When you're framing your US national China strategy, it has to be done on the basis that you understand the domestic complexity of Chinese politics. One of the complaints I have about the Trump administration's diplomacy is it lumps everyone in together. China. There is a big difference between A, Xi Jinping and the rest of the Chinese Communist Party, B, between the Chinese Communist Party, all 89 million members, and the other 1.3 billion who make up the rest of the country, and C, a big difference between the party and the private sector. So an effective American diplomacy and high strategy actually must be determined on what core strategic interests are you going to seek to prosecute, which individual Chinese behaviours are you seeking to change, and to do that, which audiences within the country are best kept on side and those against whom you are seeking to add leverage. Because if you don't, you enable Chinese leadership to simply circle the wagons. And we are China and Chinese against all you guys out there. And finally, to say this, that in such a strategy, you need to carve out space also for the areas where you seek still to cooperate with China. Global economic management is critical, in my view. I've worked as Prime Minister through the financial crisis. That's when my hair turned white. I was elected just before it, and I was there for the whole lot of it. And we worked very well with the Chinese throughout that period. And we've got major structural challenges for the future global management and macro stability of the global economy, but also the other fundamental and existential challenge for all of us, which is the future of climate change. And you're the world's two greatest emitters by a country mile. You two don't act, and the rest of us burn, baby, burn. And the two of you must act together, China being the largest emitter now by far. And to conclude, if you're going to have a US national China strategy, and this may seem to be wildly utopian of an intelligent, good-looking audience like this, but it's to say it has to be bipartisan and enduring. The reason I say this is just not for fun, because this is an existential question for your country for this century. How you manage the China challenge, whether you manage it intelligently, counterproductively, or not at all. And therefore, when I look back at Kennan, and I'm not advocating containment, and the politics of 47-48, when he wrote the X article in Foreign Affairs magazine, and then and prior to that did the long telegram from Moscow. That was under the Truman administration. But containment became bipartisan American strategy in dealing with the Soviet challenge from 1948 for 40 years until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if you read Kennan's strategy at the birth, a large part of the reason the Soviet Union finally imploded was because of what he predicted would happen if we maintained that strategy for the duration through multiple Democrat and Republican administrations over 40 years. History tells us, therefore, that you guys can do that. All I'm saying is we face, I think, a parallel critical challenge today of a different type. But this place is not called the world's oldest democracy for nothing. You have a bunch of smarts, a bunch of national smarts, and you can harness the talents in order to do this. I look forward to your questions.
I have only one question to ask you. She's going to bring me a mic. I'll use this one.
Because I've got this.
Is it turned on? Hello? Oh, yes, it is. So I was going to ask you about the situation with the rivalry in technology, but I think you've already somewhat answered that. So I'd like to focus on a different one. You have described Xi Jinping as China's most powerful leader since Chairman Mao. So I ask you, do you think the trade war has weakened or strengthened his standing within the Communist Party leadership?
The untidy answer from me is both. Let me explain what I mean by that. It's weakened his leadership because the ongoing credibility and legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, as I said before, depends on whether they continue to deliver the economic goods. Living standards keep rising, poverty continues to be eliminated, China has greater global capacity. But for a set of domestic policy settings that I referred to before, there's been a much less positive environment for the Chinese private sector, so growth has slowed. Then comes the Donald with the trade war. And whatever you think of the President of the United States, I don't know whose politics is what in this room, the bottom line is, though I can't stand tariffs, I think they're bad economic policy, he really has seized China's attention to give him full credit. He really has. And the president, during the course of 2018 and into 2019, has caused a deep drawing in of breath in China about how the hell do we settle this thing? Because if you add the pressure of $360 billion worth of Chinese, getting on for $500 billion worth of Chinese exports into the American market, it represents a big slice of Chinese GDP. And therefore, if you begin to contract that radically on top of slowing growth domestically, you start to produce numbers and realities within China which threaten party legitimacy because growth slows radically. And in the last 40 years or so, despite the global financial crisis, despite the implosions of 1989 and the 3 years of financial sanctions following, they still managed to keep the economy growing. It was smaller then and a less complex task. So on the downside for him, and therefore affecting his legitimacy, is an internal critique of Xi Jinping as to why have you managed to so aggravate the Americans, to cause them to do this, compounding our pre-existing economic problems and the fundamental importance of the economy to our party's legitimacy. The flip side of it is this, which is the part of the problem with this administration's management of the conclusion of the trade war in the last 3 months, particularly since the breakdown of negotiations in Washington in May, and again in Shanghai just last month, is that it's been done in a manner and in a tweeted manner which has enabled the Chinese propaganda apparatus to depict this as a fundamental assault on China itself. And so when, for example, the President the other day described inaccurately, in my view, China as a currency manipulator, accurate accusation 10 years ago, not today. The Chinese yuan has appreciated about 45% over the last decade or so. It's quite significant. So therefore, when things like that happen, the leadership in China is able to circle the wagons, and they play the nationalist card, and that actually strengthens the leadership against the great assault from the American foreign devil. So, as I said, it cuts both ways.
Since I'll never be able to answer a question with that much clarity, I'm going to sit down and let these people see what you can tell them. Thank you so much.
Happy to do that. If anyone's got any really hard questions, Andrew Saul is over here. He's a good friend of mine. He can answer them for me.
I'm going to leave the video.
Yes, sir. Over you. Do you need a microphone?
We'll see. What do you think Chinese strategy is related to North Korea?
Well, North Korea, I think, if I was trying to be baseline about it rather than talking fluff, China, wants to be seen by the United States and the international community as being helpful in bringing about the denuclearization of North Korea. B, however, China will never sacrifice any of its fundamental interests in terms of its bilateral relationship with North Korea, with whom it shares a significant border, in order to achieve A, above. And C, their realist assumption in Beijing is that Kim Jong-un, who locally they call Fatty Kim, Jin Panza is his nickname in Chinese, is that he will keep his nuclear weapons, and that from China's strategic point of view, while that may not be desirable, it's acceptable because they're never going to be targeted against China. They're only likely to compound the strategic difficulties of America and its allies in the Asia-Pacific region. So I am skeptical, deeply skeptical, as the possibility of the president's diplomacy with Kim Jong-un yielding the outcome which he's defined, which is the removal of all North Korean nuclear weapons, for those reasons. So,
what about the situation of the Chinese economy right now? You said something.
Chinese economy right now, okay. I think if you, I don't know who follows here global markets carefully, but in 2015 was a big year for the Chinese in economic management because their domestic markets melted down. There was a major crash on the Chinese stock markets in 2015, which spilled over into the Chinese financial system because a lot of people had been borrowing from banks in order to invest in stocks and shares. And because they couldn't visit the casino in Macau, then the stock market was the next best thing. Not that there are any parallels with this country or any other. But, and in China, because it's got a limited experience of its development of its equities market, it's seriously the wild, wild east. It's kind of Dodge City 1860 without the rules. Now, sorry for anyone here from Dodge City, by the way. So, when all that happened, Xi Jinping went nuts. He just went nuts. Because suddenly, you had so many Chinese citizens losing huge amounts of money on stock markets. You had a beginning of the collapse or the bursting of the assets bubble around both equities and around real estate, and a significant exposure to being felt by a whole range of Chinese financial institutions. His reaction against all that was twofold. One, at a narrow level, taking the advice of those closest to him, was to begin a significant deleveraging campaign within China in order to improve the balance sheets of China's principal financial institutions. However, in the implementation of the deleveraging campaign, what the Chinese major state banks did was overwhelmingly preference credit allocation, or credit rationing, if you like, to state-owned enterprises. Private firms were starved. And the pattern that emerged from 16 and 17 and through to last year was increasingly these private businesses having liquidity problems, but certainly a lack of finance for future expansion. The second response was more, shall I say, generic, which was Xi Jinping's impulse was then to say, if this is what a free market's going to deliver me in the future, a massive stock market bust, well, thank you very much, guys. But so much for the rest of your bold new plan for phase 2 market economic reform across the total economy, a blueprint for which they had released in 2013. So the double impact of deleveraging, but the abandonment of phase 2 market economic reform was an increasingly hostile environment for Chinese private firms. And so in my experiences of dealing with Chinese chief executives from private firms, which I do a lot of, I'm president of the Asia Policy Institute, part of the Asia Society in New York, and in that capacity I'm in China every couple of months, and I'm dealing with a lot of Chinese corporate leaders, is that the tonality of their conversations with people like me radically started changing last year. And they began saying that the only thing they could do was sit on their hands. If they had cash, keep cash, don't invest. And by the way, Kevin, have you got a visa to go to Australia? This is not an enormous sign of confidence in investing in the domestic economy. So those two trends then flowed through to where we are today. The last thing I'd say in response to your question was the message finally got through to the central leadership in November last year. A major speech by Xi Jinping from memory on the 1st of November last year in Beijing. He brought together China's top 100 private entrepreneurs for a set-piece speech in the Great Hall of the People. Everyone's on the best of their behaviour, with a subtext of which was, what's happened the last couple of years, that was just meant not to strangle you, that was just one big bear hug. And then he announced a whole series of measures to reduce the tax rate for SMEs, to small and medium-sized firms. He then introduced a new liquidity policy, a new credit policy, for the banks in providing liquidity for firms. But as of the last couple of weeks, when I've just had another series of sessions with Chinese chief executives, overall, their critique is still that very little of this has actually hit the road. And that's 6 months already. So the growth numbers now, I think, are very challenged indeed against the benchmark of 6% growth, which they internally believe they need to have in order to sustain employment, social, and therefore political stability. One up the front, then there, then there, then there, then I'll go over here. Yeah.
Am I at the front?
You're the front. There's no one in front of you.
Can you help us unpack what you think is going on in Trump's mind in terms of his relationship? Because, we started out where he had Xi Jinping down to Mar-a-Lago and they were playing golf and they were good friends. And then he puts this big fat bullseye on China, which he's not put on Putin, which he's not put on North Korea. So what do you think what's behind what Trump's trying to do?
I think it is easier for me to predict Xi Jinping than the president. And again, I'm not trying to be nasty here, but the president changes his mind a lot. I mean, I think all of you in this room would have seen evidence of that. But to be fair to the president, number one, what he said in his election campaign about China being trade cheaters, he's kind of stuck to. Many Americans say this to me, and I don't know the president. I met him once in my life. Okay, I've known all of his predecessors, well, going back a reasonable distance. I've worked with many of them. But I don't know this guy. But to be fair to him, what he said in the election campaign about China being trade cheats, he has sought to prosecute that campaign as vigorously as possible through the trade negotiations. He's also said that the bilateral trade deficit was unsustainable. That's a separate piece of economic argument in my view. We Australians have run a bilateral trade deficit with you since about 1945, and no Australians would know that because we just see that as kind of one of the things that happens. We run surpluses with other people, not with you. But the President has a particularly mercantilist view of bilateral trade deficits. But on the key question of the trade rules and the economic rules, that is intellectual property protection, patent protection, forced technology transfer, as well as state subsidy for Chinese firms operating around the world, he's been pretty consistent about giving support to his negotiators to prosecute those interests. So most of his allies, silently, maybe not publicly, give him real credit for that. Where the criticism emerges is President Trump's ability to seal the deal, because agreement in 3 of the 4 categories I've just mentioned before, frankly, has been virtually done. The stuff where disagreement has emerged is in a series of other, what I would describe as lesser areas. If you're interested, the bullet point summary is the American trade negotiators' insistence that in the text of the actual agreement with the Chinese, that the Chinese stipulate there how and when they will legislate and produce regulations to give effect to the agreement. The Chinese say that's an offence to our national sovereignty, that's for us to decide how we implement. The Americans say once we have an agreement, we Americans will keep tariffs in force until we think you're being fair, you're being real about it all. The Chinese say, what's the point of an agreement if you're going to keep the tariffs on? The Americans say, if in the future we Americans judge that you're violating the spirit and the text of this agreement, we'll impose punitive tariffs, but we're going to tie your hands in the terms of this agreement and prevent you in the future from retaliating. The Chinese would say, that's an unequal treaty. Thank you very much. Go away, jump in the lake. That's the Chinese response, and I would regard these as lesser issues than the primary ones where the President, to be fair to him, has achieved some reasonable success. So our question, and I think the valid question for the President is why not seal this deal which in substance is, on the major questions, is relatively close? Because the downstream consequences are of not sealing it is, if you like, from a political point of view, no, from a market point of view, I think people that understand that we go into the year 2020, America already 10 years into business expansion. It's a long business and economic cycle against US historical standards. It's the longest. There's a lot of headwinds in the global economy for other reasons. Look at the Gulf, look at geopolitics, look at energy, etc. We've run out of stimulatory room with monetary policy and fiscal policy. The world has basically exhausted those tools through the last financial crisis and great global recession. There's not much left there. So you want to throw an enduring trade war on the top of all that, then you run a grave risk of throwing this country into recession next year, when based on my knowledge of the American political cycle is there's likely to be a presidential election next year. And so he may be advised by some of those around him that you keep doing this, you'll put so much downward pressure on the Chinese economy, you throw them into recession. That may achieve some political outcomes that the President may be seeking for in terms of leadership destabilization in China. But then there's the rolling global impact of an underperforming Chinese economy globally. And you begin to see the softening of Japanese and East Asian growth already through the roll-on consequences of the US-China trade war. Lady at the back there.
How do you assess the potential for China to have leverage over the United States as a result of all the American debt that they have purchased?
I think it's a genuine double-edged sword. The question was, to what extent could the Chinese use China's purchase of such a large amount of treasuries, that is US debt, as a wider leverage point against the United States? That's my summary. I'm sorry, but it's not the same. To which my response was, it's a double-edged sword. That is, if the Chinese would begin to really play with that, then they're going to suffer a whole lot of losses themselves. And my observation of the way in which the Chinese have played their possession of, let's call it foreign treasury notes, is that they never seek to incur losses on their transactions for political or geopolitical reasons. More broadly, for those who follow debt markets, public debt markets, more closely than I do, you will see that the high point of the Chinese ownership of American debt was probably about 5 years ago. And now the curve is still like this, but the possession, I think we're still looking at around about the $2 trillion mark. But it's coming down as the Chinese seek to widen and diversify their foreign debt holdings. So I think it's unlikely. So,
do you think there's any possibility that the United States government, under the aegis of the CIA, is funding the dissidents in Hong Kong against China as a way to embarrass Xi Jinping?
I've got no such evidence, nor do I believe it would be in America's interest to do that. And I've seen so much. Look, I've lived in Hong Kong. My middle son was born in Hong Kong. I know lots of Hong Kongers. We in the Asia Society have a major office in Hong Kong. I'm there quite often. What happened was that Hong Kong government just went too far with this foreign extradition law. It's like taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Why did they do it? The anti-corruption campaign in China, launched by Xi Jinping in pursuit of corrupt officials, paid off by a whole bunch of business people, either Chinese domestic or some in Hong Kong, has been going on now for years, and a whole bunch of people from Chinese mainland have fled to Hong Kong, or Hong Kongers who have been provided, so we say, interesting inducements are in Hong Kong. So the response to this has been, well, we'll make it generically possible for the People's Republic of China through the agency of a special, of a universal extradition law to extradite to China anyone. It'll still have to go through a bunch of legal processes, but it is far too broad an instrument which would lead itself to the sorts of concerns you see evidence on the streets of Hong Kong by anybody, including people who politically dissent against Beijing, that they can just legally come and be nabbed and taken back to China. I think it's been a big political miscalculation by the government of Hong Kong. And therefore, it crossed a mental and emotional Rubicon with the Hong Kong people. Like, I was there in 1984 as a kid when they did the joint declaration. I was there in 1997 participating in the handover ceremonies. There were no massive protests at the time because one country, two systems was generally seen as the most pragmatic independence supporting framework for the long-term future. But what we've seen in more recent years by the Hong Kong government is an incremental overreach in trying to anticipate, I think excessively, what Beijing wants. And as a consequence, the Hong Kong people have just said, pardon the pun, no way Jose. You know, they're just saying, no, not going to do that.
I think we have time for one more.
I'll take one question here and one on this side, and then we'll go, yeah, so.
Going back to Hong Kong, you gave some very interesting reasons why China would not invade Hong Kong, but how is this going to wind down?
I wish I knew. I've got some private views we can chat about later if you like. But it would be in the protest movement's interest to de-escalate at this stage. It would be in the protest movement's interest to de-escalate at this stage and to internally conclude what they next need to campaign for at some later stage, perhaps not too far removed. But in terms of the politics of permanent and continuing escalation, you begin to increase risks against what we see at present. Within current parameters, I think Beijing's calculus is as I described before. But if we see this being the trajectory for the future of the protest movement now, then we will at some stage begin to cross a Rubicon. I can't point to that point, but I know I'm reasonably confident of my judgment about where things stand at the moment. Sorry, there was someone over here I promised a question to. Yes.
If the United States and our allies fail to maintain our geopolitical power and dominance, and China fills that void, what does that look like for us as a society?
That's a really good question, and to roll that in at the end of the evening is just really unfair. The question was, let's just say the United States doesn't sustain the balance of power in its favour long term. And let's just say China then occupies that vacuum globally. What does it look like? And how does it affect American interests? Is that a reasonable summary of your question? What I'm confident of, in my judgment, is what China seeks to do within the region, that is, East Asia and the West Pacific. And that is, and with its border states, as I referred to in my earlier remarks. That is, it wants to push America out and wants to be the dominant power. It doesn't want to invade any of those countries, but it does expect, under those circumstances, them to be utterly accommodating to China's core interests. And that will mean a net decline in national sovereignty for that range of US allies within East Asia and the West Pacific. What it means then, if that occurs to the United States, is the level of access, hospitable reception, openness to the American economy that you currently experience in what I would call the East Asian Hemisphere will begin to lessen. Does it materially affect the national security of continental United States? No. Does it materially affect the future of the American economy, given the relative global size of the Asia-Pacific economy in the 21st century? Yes. And where the open question is, and because there's not a completed script in Beijing for this as yet, is that what it means for the global rules-based order, the future of human rights, anchored in not just American domestic aspiration and what you have in your own constitutional arrangements and the Bill of Rights here, but the international instruments, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the 9 other human rights treaties. Are these just going to be dead letters hanging in the swinging in the breeze, or will they be just marginalised by China over time? Why? Because each of them represents a challenge to Chinese domestic political practice. What does it mean for the future of the global trading order? Well, President Trump has demonstrated he's not the best friend of the World Trade Organization, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. But China's own domestic trading practices, international trading practices, have been far from free. If they dominate the global economy and begin to reshape the rules of the WTO, it would be naive to assume that they're going to become freer. It will be, in my judgment, in a more mercantilist direction in support of China itself. And I think the last challenge in the financial system will be a final assault on the United States dollar as the global reserve currency. China can't do that yet because the yuan is not tradable. But if these global circumstances and regional circumstances change fundamentally over the next several decades through to mid-century, when the Chinese celebrate the centenary of the establishment of the People's Republic in 2049, I'll be back that year to speak here in Nantucket. And so will Joe. Then I think you'll see an interesting set of challenges against the dollar in that intervening period as well. Is the national security of the state of Utah under threat? No. But are these other factors now at play? Yes, they are. And that's without touching on the wonderful world of tech and AI, where you guys have been world leaders, world standard setters, and the deliverer of great global public and private goods for the better part of 40 to 50 years now. I'm looking carefully here at Chuck, who's had something to do with this. And if the rules change, first to a bifurcated system, an American system, of 5G, a non-American Chinese system of 5G, an American system of ICT, a Chinese plus system of ICT through the BRI economies, an American system for the future of AI, a Chinese one which has unlimited data to tap, no ethical constraints, multiple opportunities for comprehensive machine learning, and all the applications of the future. Where does that take America's net competitiveness against China for the rest of the century, given those factors will constitute major new drivers of global growth or not? But to conclude on this point, you Americans have an enormous capacity to reinvent yourselves. China finds it very hard to reinvent itself. 3,000 years of continuous history has great advantages, but a few downsides. Okay, the idea of walking up to a Chinese leader and saying, listen, comrade, you need to reinvent yourself. It does, like I can say that in Chinese, but they'll go, whereas you say this to Americans, it kind of comes semi-naturally. The Chinese got you wrong at the time of the global financial crisis. They counted you down and almost out. I remember saying to Chinese leaders at the time, these Yanks, they come back, just be careful. And you did, okay, roaring. Look at the strength of the American economy today. So when I look at your capacity to economically reinvent yourself, to technologically reinvent yourself, and if you can apply that, I hate to end on a bit of a downer, politically reinvent yourself, that is, make your institutions capable of delivering major national outcomes which need long-term bipartisan consensus, not just on a national China strategy, but a national infrastructure strategy, national STEM strategy, national education strategy, the sort of stuff that Eisenhower and Kennedy would talk about every other day. Why can't you do that again? Well, you can. And I'm confident that you've got it within your American zeitgeist to do that. So I'm still backing you. Thank you.